The Hensley family had always been a symbol of prosperity and respect in the small town of Briarwood. Their mansion, standing tall on the hill, was a landmark, its grandeur a reflection of the family's success. Samuel Hensley, the patriarch, was a quiet man respected for his business acumen and unwavering moral compass. His wife, Lydia, was the perfect complement, a poised woman who hosted lavish gatherings, always with a smile that never seemed to falter. They had 3 children, 2 boys and a girl, who were always well-dressed, well-spoken, and well-behaved, a picture of a perfect family. No one ever questioned their wealth or their influence. But beneath the surface of their impeccable image, something began to stir. A quiet unease crept into the community, a feeling that lingered like a shadow, though no one could put a finger on it. Whispers started, first in the local tavern, then at the market, and eventually in the corners of the town square. People began to notice that the Hensley children, once seen running freely through the fields or playing with other local children, were no longer visible. The sounds of their laughter and footsteps had gone silent. The Hensleys themselves seemed to grow colder, more distant. The children were never seen at the dinner parties, never heard at the church gatherings, and their absence became a topic that no one dared to speak of directly. When someone did mention the children, their faces would turn pale and the conversation would quickly change. Rumors floated just out of reach of the town's collective consciousness. Some said the children had been sent away to boarding school in the city, but no one had ever seen a letter or received a visit from them. Others whispered that the children had fallen ill, locked away in rooms far from the public eye. But the most chilling rumor of all was that the children had never left at all, that they had been hidden away in the attic of the Hensley mansion. The attic, an ominous space no one was allowed to enter, became a source of strange fascination. The door, always locked, stood like a silent sentinel at the top of the stairs, as if it were guarding something that could not and should not be seen. The Hensleys, who once greeted the town with warmth and open arms, began to withdraw into their home, their once open doors now sealed tight. No one was allowed near the mansion after dark, and the rare glimpses of the family members through the windows were enough to send a chill down the spine of anyone who caught sight of them. What had happened to the children? Where were they? Why had they been kept out of sight? And more hauntingly, what was it that kept the Hensleys from speaking about them? The town, once bustling with life, now seemed to move with a hushed air of fear. The Hensleys' legacy was beginning to fracture, their outward perfection giving way to an eerie silence that hung heavily over the entire town. The questions lingered in the air, unanswered, but with each passing day the sense of dread grew stronger. The cracks in the Hensley family's flawless facade were slowly beginning to show, and the town could feel that something dark was buried beneath it all. Something that, if uncovered, would change everything. It started with the whispers. At first, Alice thought it was just the wind, the way it would sometimes sneak through the cracks of the old houses in Briarwood. The sound would swirl around the trees, rustling the leaves, carrying something faint but undeniably there. A voice. Not quite words, but the cadence of something speaking, something waiting to be heard. At night she would lie in bed listening to the wind, but over time the whispers grew louder, more distinct. They didn't belong to the trees, they came from the direction of the Hensley mansion. Alice had lived next door to the Hensleys for years, but she'd never felt a chill like this before. It was as if the house itself was breathing, sighing in the dark, stirring with a presence. There was no denying it. The whispers were there, a strange, unnatural sound that drifted across the yard in the dead of night. No one in the neighborhood ever spoke about it openly, but Alice could sense that others had heard it too. When she saw them, the townsfolk would exchange uneasy glances, eyes flicking toward the Hensley estate before hurriedly turning away. They too felt it, the dread. It was impossible to ignore. But what Alice couldn't shake was the feeling that it wasn't just whispers. It was something more, something like shuffling footsteps. Sometimes when she stood on her porch in the late hours, she could hear them, slow, deliberate steps. A dragging sound as though something was being moved with great effort, just above the ceiling of the mansion. The house wasn't empty. But who was moving up there? The Hensleys? They never left their home anymore. Not during the day. Not at night. The air around their mansion had thickened in a way that Alice couldn't describe. It was as though a thick fog of secrecy and silence clung to the windows, muting everything around it. She had to know. Her curiosity had already begun to gnaw at her, but now it had turned into something darker. The need to understand, to uncover what had become of the Hensley children was more urgent. She couldn't ignore it. One evening, as the light of dusk began to bleed into the shadows, Alice decided to act. She had seen enough of the house from the outside to know the layout, and after weeks of listening to the noises, she had come to a decision. She would find the source. She waited until the Hensleys were likely to be at one of their infrequent outings, her heartbeat quickening with the thought of venturing so close to a secret that had remained buried for years. With each creak of the floor beneath her feet, Alice felt the weight of the mansion's quiet on her shoulders, a pressure that seemed to push against her chest. She had no idea what she would find, or what it would cost her, but the whispers were no longer enough. She needed to see what was hidden behind that locked door. The attic. The Hensleys' dark secret. She made her way across the lawn toward the back of the house where the servants' entrance was tucked away. It had always seemed out of place, as though it were meant to be ignored. But Alice couldn't ignore it anymore. The house wasn't silent, it never had been. The sounds came from within, and now they were louder than ever. Alice stood in front of the Hensley mansion's rear entrance, the shadows of dusk swallowing her every step. Her breath was shallow, quickened by the anticipation of what lay behind the door that had remained locked for so many years. The whispers had been louder that night, sharper in their urgency, almost as if the house itself were calling to her, urging her to uncover its secret. The old house creaked under the weight of time, its once pristine facade now worn and weary. The garden was overgrown, and the windows, dark, empty eyes, seemed to watch her every move. As she approached the back hallway, Alice's fingers trembled with a strange, growing unease. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of old wood and dust. She had never been inside this part of the house before. The Hensleys had kept to themselves. The servants always made themselves scarce, and no one was ever allowed in this corner of the mansion. A slight thud rang out as her shoes scraped against the floor, an unnatural sound that seemed to echo in the quiet. She pushed the thought from her mind. She was close. She could feel it. Her hand rested against the back wall of the hallway, fingers grazing along its surface as she made her way toward the forgotten corner of the mansion. Then she found it, hidden in plain sight. A bookshelf, older than the rest of the room's furnishings, stood against the far wall. The heavy wood was stained, the edges chipped from years of neglect. It should have been a simple piece of furniture, but Alice could feel it, a faint tug as though the shelf was beckoning her, promising the revelation of something unimaginable. Her heart raced as her fingers ran along the grain of the wood. A moment later, a soft click broke the silence. The shelf moved. A hidden door. Alice's stomach churned and her hands shook as she pushed it open. The passage behind it was narrow and suffocating, like the breath of the house itself closing in on her. She hesitated for only a moment before stepping inside. The attic was darker than she could have imagined. The air was stale, thick with the musk of decay, and a feeling of oppressive weight settled on her chest. It smelled of rot, dust, mildew, and something else she couldn't place. as she strained her eyes to make out the room. The sight before her struck her like a punch to the gut. The attic, once a hidden place, now revealed its terrible secrets. Broken toys lay scattered across the floor, ragged dolls, their limbs torn off, eyes gouged out, abandoned as though they had once been loved but had long since been forgotten. The remnants of childhoods that had never seen the light of day. Old clothes, faded and torn, lay in piles like forgotten memories stained with time and sorrow. Alice's pulse quickened as she stepped further into the room, her eyes drawn to the strange markings on the walls. At first they appeared to be the idle scribblings of a child, but as she examined them more closely, she realized they were far from innocent. Symbols, dark and twisted, etched into the wood, patterns that didn't belong in a home. The walls seemed to pulse with the weight of history, a story written in blood and fear. The unmistakable feeling of being watched crawled up Alice's spine. She couldn't shake the sensation that the room, the entire house, was alive with the memory of something unspeakable. The room was filled with remnants of lost innocence, of children who had been erased from the world. But there were no signs of life here now, just silence. And that silence was deafening. The weight of the attic's secret pressed against her chest, suffocating her. She knew in that moment that nothing would ever be the same. The Hensleys had kept their children locked away, their existence hidden from the world. The horror of what she had uncovered sank into Alice's bones, and a deep sense of dread settled in her heart. The house, the family, the town, everything had been a lie. The truth was far darker than she could have ever imagined. The Hensleys had kept their children locked away, but for what purpose? And who would pay the price for this monstrous secret? The air in the attic felt heavier now, as if the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for Alice to understand the truth. She stood frozen among the broken toys, the faded clothes, and the strange markings on the walls. The whispers from before seemed louder now, echoing in her mind, their words no longer just shadows but voices from the past, desperate to be heard. Alice's heart beat in her chest like a drum, each thump carrying the weight of something she couldn't yet comprehend. She pressed her palm against the cool, damp wall and closed her eyes. And then the whispers began again, clearer this time, as if the house had opened up to her, revealing its darkest secrets. The first voice was soft, childlike, barely a breath. "Anna," it whispered. "Anna, the youngest." Alice's eyes shot open. She hadn't heard that name before, but it felt familiar, like a distant memory tugging at the edges of her consciousness. The name carried with it a sense of fragility, like something delicate, something lost. Another voice joined in, this one tinged with sadness. "Charles, he never cried." The words hung in the air, chilling her to the bone. Anna, Charles. Who were these children? Why had they been locked away? The whispers continued, each one adding more weight to Alice's growing sense of horror. Eliza, the quiet one, always watching. The names came one after the other like an endless procession of lost souls. Each child had their own silent story, their own suffering. Eliza had watched in silence as the others endured but never spoke, never made a sound. Charles had been the youngest boy, the one who never cried, perhaps too numb to even feel the pain. Anna had been the baby, her innocence taken from her before she ever had a chance to see the world. The more Alice listened, the more the voices became real. Vivid memories of lives lived in shadow and silence. The children, once full of laughter and life, had been erased from history, their existence written over by lies and secrets. The Hensleys had hidden them away, keeping them locked in this attic, their fate sealed in isolation. Alice's hands trembled as she reached out to touch the wall where the markings seemed to grow darker, more deliberate. The symbols etched into the wood weren't just random scrawls. They were part of the ritual, part of the silence that had been forced upon these children. They had been forgotten, but Alice couldn't forget them now. She couldn't unhear their voices, their names, their stories. She had uncovered the terrible truth of the Hensley children, and with it came a wave of helplessness that crashed over her like a tidal wave. What had they endured? What had they been forced to live through, alone, hidden from the world? Alice wanted to scream, but the words caught in her throat. She wasn't just witnessing the horrors of their past, she was beginning to feel them. The cold, the darkness, the silence. It was all around her now, pressing in from every direction. The Hensleys had erased their children from history, but Alice could no longer pretend that they had never existed. She could no longer ignore the truth. The children had lived, and they had suffered in ways Alice could never fully understand. And now, their fate had become hers to bear. The air in the attic felt heavier now, as if the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for Alice to understand the truth. She stood frozen among the broken toys, the faded clothes, and the strange markings on the walls. The whispers from before seemed louder now, echoing in her mind, their words no longer just shadows, but voices from the past, desperate to be heard. Alice's heart beat in her chest like a drum, each thump carrying the weight of something she couldn't yet comprehend. She pressed her palm against the cool, damp wall and closed her eyes. And then, the whispers began again, clearer this time, as if the house had opened up to her, revealing its darkest secrets. The first voice was soft, childlike, barely a breath. "Anna," it whispered. "Anna, the youngest." Alice's eyes shot open. She hadn't heard that name before, but it felt familiar, like a distant memory tugging at the edges of her consciousness. The name carried with it a sense of fragility, like something delicate, something lost. Another voice joined in, this one tinged with sadness. "Charles, he never cried." The words hung in the air, chilling her to the bone. Anna, Charles. Who were these children? Why had they been locked away? The whispers continued, each one adding more weight to Alice's growing sense of horror. Eliza, the quiet one, always watching. The names came one after the other like an endless procession of lost souls. Each child had their own silent story, their own suffering. Eliza had watched in silence as the others endured, but never spoke, never made a sound. Charles had been the youngest boy, the one who never cried, perhaps too numb to even feel the pain. Anna had been the baby, her innocence taken from her before she ever had a chance to see the world. The more Alice listened, the more the voices became real, vivid memories of lives lived in shadow and silence. The children, once full of laughter and life, had been erased from history, their existence written over by lies and secrets. The Hensleys had hidden them away, keeping them locked in this attic, their fate sealed in isolation. Alice's hands trembled as she reached out to touch the wall where the markings seemed to grow darker, more deliberate. The symbols etched into the wood weren't just random scrawls. They were part of the ritual, part of the silence that had been forced upon these children. They had been forgotten. But Alice couldn't forget them now. She couldn't unhear their voices, their names, their stories. She had uncovered the terrible truth of the Hensley children, and with it came a wave of helplessness that crashed over her like a tidal wave. What had they endured? What had they been forced to live through, alone, hidden from the world? Alice wanted to scream, but the words caught in her throat. She wasn't just witnessing the horrors of their past. She was beginning to feel them, the cold, the darkness, the silence. It was all around her now, pressing in from every direction. The Hensleys had erased their children from history, but Alice could no longer pretend that they had never existed. She could no longer ignore the truth. The children had lived, and they had suffered in ways Alice could never fully understand. And now, their fate had become hers to bear. The whispers had stopped, replaced by a thick silence that hung heavy in the air. Alice stood in the attic, the weight of the children's stories pressing on her chest. But one name continued to echo in her mind: Anna. She was the youngest, the last child, the one whose life had been consumed by something darker than mere neglect. Alice's curiosity had led her to the truth, but now it was pulling her deeper into a history that seemed impossible to escape. The attic, with its broken toys and faded clothes, seemed to hold a different kind of secret, one that belonged to Anna alone. As Alice examined the remnants of the children's lives, her eyes fell upon a small, delicate doll. Its face was cracked, but the hair, blonde, soft, was untouched. It looked eerily familiar. A chill ran down her spine as she realized it was Anna's. There was something about it. Something about the doll that made her feel as though she were holding a piece of the child herself. Anna, the youngest, the most vulnerable. She had been the one they had planned to sacrifice. The voices began again, but this time they weren't just whispers. They were clearer, sharper, like they were coming from somewhere inside Alice's mind. The ritual, the final act. Anna was never meant to survive. The house, the family, the twisted beliefs that had held them captive for so long. All of it had been leading to one horrific conclusion. The Hensleys had planned to offer Anna up, to extinguish the last of their children and bind themselves to the dark forces they had worshipped for years. But something had gone wrong. The ritual, something ancient and unholy, was supposed to have claimed Anna's life, but for reasons unknown, she had survived. Against all odds, she had lived. Alice's heart pounded in her chest as she tried to piece together the truth. Anna was the key. She was the last living witness to the horrors the Hensleys had hidden away in the attic, the last link to the family's cursed past. Her survival was not a miracle. It was an anomaly. Something had gone wrong, but no one had questioned it. Anna had been left to live in the shadows, discarded like the rest of her family, a living reminder of something that had gone horribly awry. Alice could feel the weight of Anna's survival as if it were a living thing, breathing in the air around her. She had been kept hidden, locked away in silence for years. And now, Alice realized, the truth had found its way to her. The last child had lived, but the cost of her survival was written in the darkness of the attic, in the rituals, and in the twisted legacy of the Hensley family. It was a story that had been buried, but now it was rising, and with it came a chilling sense of inevitability. Anna had survived, but at what cost? What had become of her? And what would Alice do with the knowledge of what had happened in that attic? What had been done to Anna and the others? The question lingered in the air, unanswered, but its weight was unmistakable. The whispers had stopped, replaced by a thick silence that hung heavy in the air. Alice stood in the attic, the weight of the children's stories pressing on her chest. But one name continued to echo in her mind: Anna. She was the youngest, the last child, the one whose life had been consumed by something darker than mere neglect. Alice's curiosity had led her to the truth, but now it was pulling her deeper into a history that seemed impossible to escape. The attic, with its broken toys and faded clothes, seemed to hold a different kind of secret, one that belonged to Anna alone. As Alice examined the remnants of the children's lives, her eyes fell upon a small, delicate doll. Its face was cracked, but the hair, blonde, soft, was untouched. It looked eerily familiar. A chill ran down her spine as she realized it was Anna's. There was something about it, something about the doll that made her feel as though she were holding a piece of the child herself. Anna, the youngest, the most vulnerable. She had been the one they had planned to sacrifice. The voices began again, but this time they weren't just whispers. They were clearer, sharper, like they were coming from somewhere inside Alice's mind. The ritual, the final act. Anna was never meant to survive. The house, the family, the twisted beliefs that had held them captive for so long, all of it had been leading to one horrific conclusion. The Hensleys had planned to offer Anna up, to extinguish the last of their children and bind themselves to the dark forces they had worshipped for years. But something had gone wrong. The ritual, something ancient and unholy, was supposed to have claimed Anna's life, but for reasons unknown, she had survived. Against all odds, she had lived. Alice's heart pounded in her chest as she tried to piece together the truth. Anna was the key. She was the last living witness to the horrors the Hensleys had hidden away in the attic, the last link to the family's cursed past. Her survival was not a miracle. It was an anomaly. Something had gone wrong, but no one had questioned it. Anna had been left to live in the shadows, discarded like the rest of her family, a living reminder of something that had gone horribly awry. Alice could feel the weight of Anna's survival as if it were a living thing, breathing in the air around her. She had been kept hidden, locked away in silence for years. And now, Alice realized, the truth had found its way to her. The last child had lived, but the cost of her survival was written in the darkness of the attic, in the rituals, and in the twisted legacy of the Hensley family. It was a story that had been buried, but now it was rising, and with it came a chilling sense of inevitability. Anna had survived, but at what cost? What had become of her? And what would Alice do with the knowledge of what had happened in that attic? What had been done to Anna and the others? The question lingered in the air, unanswered, but its weight was unmistakable. The air in the attic had grown colder, the shadows deeper. Alice could feel it, an unshakable presence pressing in from all sides as if the walls themselves were closing in. Every step she took seemed to echo in the silence, amplifying her fear. The remnants of the children's lives were still scattered around her. But now the attic had become something far darker, something that no longer held any traces of innocence. Alice's eyes fell to the floor where a faint dark stain marred the wood. She knelt closer, the smell of decay mingling with the musty air. It was blood. The realization hit her like a physical blow. The stains weren't random. They formed a pattern, a series of marks that seemed deliberate, as though the blood had been poured with purpose. Her heart raced as her eyes followed the trail, leading her deeper into the attic's darkness. The walls seemed to close in on her as she moved forward, drawn by an invisible force. She reached a corner of the room, her hand trembling as it touched the rough surface of the wall. At first, it seemed like just old scratches, gouges from time and neglect. But then she saw it, a symbol drawn in what could only be blood. It was crude, twisted, and unfamiliar, but its meaning was unmistakable. It was the mark of a ritual, one that had been performed over and over again. A sickening thought crossed Alice's mind. The children had been part of something far darker than she had imagined. They had been tied to this house, to the Hensleys' twisted beliefs from the very beginning. The rituals had not been just a part of their lives, they had been the core of their existence. The walls, the floor, the very air around her seemed to have been saturated with the memories of these unspeakable acts. Alice's stomach churned as she examined the symbols, the blood, the remnants of rituals that had been performed in this very room. The markings on the walls told a story, one of pain, of suffering, of children who had been bound and sacrificed to some unseen force. And there were objects scattered around the floor, remnants of the horrors that had taken place here. Ropes, twisted and frayed, were piled near the wall. A rusted iron knife stained with blood lay forgotten in the corner. A strange wooden box sat in the center of the room, its lid slightly ajar. Alice's breath caught in her throat as she stepped closer. She could feel the weight of the box, the dark energy that seemed to radiate from it. Her hand hovered over the lid, and for a moment she hesitated. She knew deep down that whatever was inside would reveal the final piece of the Hensleys' grotesque legacy. With trembling hands, Alice opened the box. Inside, she found small, hand-carved figures, dolls perhaps, but twisted, deformed. Their faces were carved with deep, jagged lines, their bodies crudely shaped like the figures of children frozen in pain. It was clear that these objects were not meant to be toys, but tools. Tools of control, of fear, of ritualistic power. Each discovery, each object revealed another layer of the cruelty the Hensleys had inflicted on their children. The attic had been a place of horror, but it was also a symbol of the family's dark legacy, a legacy that had been buried beneath years of silence and lies. Alice could no longer deny the truth. The children had suffered here. They had been sacrificed, twisted into tools for the Hensleys' insidious beliefs. And now, the attic would forever bear witness to their torment. The blood-stained walls, the symbols, the remnants of the ritual, they were all part of a legacy that could never be forgotten. Alice stood frozen in the attic, the bloodstains still fresh in her mind, the symbols on the wall lingering like a curse. The air was thick with the weight of the past, suffocating her as she uncovered one horrifying truth after another. But even as the walls closed in around her, one question burned with a relentless fire. What had happened to Anna? The youngest, the last child of the Hensley family, had been the one who survived, the one who had somehow escaped the horrors of the attic. Or so the town believed. The whispers had once said Anna had disappeared, that she had been freed, taken away to live a life beyond the mansion's dark walls. It was a comforting thought, a belief that allowed the townspeople to rest easy, to tell themselves that the child had been saved from the madness that had consumed the rest of her siblings. But Alice's discoveries had led her to something far more sinister than anyone could have imagined. She had heard the whispers of escape, the promises of freedom, but now she could hear something else. A silence so profound it seemed to carry a weight all its own. Alice had found the evidence, the pieces of the puzzle that connected the twisted reality of Anna's survival. The truth was far darker. Anna's escape was not a victory. It was an illusion. Anna had not been freed, nor had she escaped the clutches of the Hensleys. No. Her so-called freedom had been nothing more than a cruel manipulation, a twisted version of release. She had been left to wander the house, isolated but still imprisoned. Her family, rather than setting her free, had turned her into a pawn, an instrument in their malevolent plans. The ritual that had been intended to kill Anna had failed, but the family had found a different use for her. She had been kept alive, not out of mercy, but because her survival had a purpose, one that kept her bound to the attic, bound to the house, bound to the darkness that lingered within its walls. Anna's mind, once full of life, had been slowly broken by the isolation. The whispers, the soft shuffle of her feet on the floor, the bloodstains on the walls, those were the echoes of her torment. The illusion of freedom had been nothing more than a mental trap, a way to let her believe she was free while keeping her as an unwilling participant in the Hensley family's twisted power plays. Her survival had become a tool in the family's quest for dominance, a reminder that even the smallest of lives could be manipulated for their own purposes. Alice's hands trembled as she uncovered the final pieces of Anna's story. She had not escaped. She had never escaped. She had been kept locked in a room, but it was no longer just an attic. It had become her prison, her cage. The townspeople had been fed a lie, a story to comfort them, but Anna's suffering had not ended. It had only just begun. The very idea of freedom had been a cruel joke, a mental torture. They had made her believe that she was free, but in reality she had been nothing more than a tool. Her mind fractured, her spirit broken. Alice's stomach churned as she pieced together the final horrific truth. Anna had never escaped. She had been left to suffer in isolation, her every movement watched, her every action manipulated. The family had used her just as they had used the others. The attic, the rituals, the symbols, they were all part of a larger design, a design that had never let Anna go, not truly. She had been a tool for the family's darkest desires, an unwilling participant in their evil. And now, as Alice stood there in the attic, the weight of Anna's false escape sank into her bones. The illusion of freedom had been nothing more than a reflection of the family's cruelty, and the true cost of that cruelty was Anna herself. The escape that the town had believed in was just another twisted lie, a facade created to cover up the unimaginable truth of what had really happened behind those closed doors. The suffering, the isolation, the torment, it had all been part of the same story, a story that had yet to reach its end. The town of Briarwood had always prided itself on its small-town charm, its air of comfort and familiarity where everyone knew everyone else's business. But that was before the Hensley family's dark secrets began to unravel, before the whispers became truths, and before the quiet town was forced to face the horror that had been quietly growing in the shadows for years. The discovery of the Hensley children's fate had shaken the very foundation of Briarwood. At first, the townspeople had resisted the idea that something so grotesque could have occurred under their noses. After all, the Hensleys had been pillars of the community, wealthy, respected, their names synonymous with success and honor. But the more they learned, the harder it became to ignore. The bloodstains, the symbols, the hidden attic, it all painted a picture of unspeakable cruelty that no one could deny. The children's deaths, once dismissed as tragic accidents or simply the result of illness, were now revealed to be part of something far darker. Samuel Hensley, the patriarch, had orchestrated it all, and the truth of his plan was far more horrifying than anyone could have imagined. The authorities had started their investigation, but they were met with resistance at every turn. The Hensleys' wealth and influence were like a shield, protecting them from the consequences of their actions. They were too powerful, too entrenched in the fabric of the town to be brought to justice easily. Samuel, ever the master manipulator, had cultivated relationships with those in power, ensuring that his family's skeleton stayed hidden in the closet while his wealth continued to grow. But as the truth slowly came to light, cracks began to appear in the facade. Samuel's final act of cruelty, the one he had planned to preserve his power forever, was revealed in a set of old journals found in the hidden room behind the bookshelf. The pages were stained, smudged with time and ink, but the words were unmistakable. Samuel had intended to sacrifice his own children in a final, twisted ritual, one that would bind their souls to his for eternity, ensuring that his bloodline would reign supreme forever. The ritual had failed, of course. Anna had survived, and with her survival, Samuel's plans had been shattered. But that didn't stop him from continuing his reign of terror, hiding behind his wealth, his status, and his twisted faith in the power of sacrifice. The town's shock was palpable. It was as if the ground beneath them had given way and they were falling into an abyss of their own making. They had allowed this family to flourish, to exist beyond reproach, while the very children who should have been cared for were subjected to horrors that would haunt the town for generations to come. The reckoning had begun, but it came slowly, like a storm rolling in on the horizon, its dark clouds growing larger with each passing day. The investigation, though slow and painful, was a sign that the town was finally waking up to the truth. But the question that loomed over all of it was whether the authorities, the town, and the people who had once called the Hensleys their neighbors could ever truly comprehend the depth of the cruelty that had taken place behind those closed doors. Could they face the reality of what had happened, or would they continue to turn a blind eye? The reckoning was far from over, but it had started, and with it came a slow burn of fear, guilt, and sorrow, as Briarwood finally came to terms with the horrors that had unfolded within its own borders. The Hensleys had lived with impunity for so long, but now, as the truth spread like wildfire, the town could no longer deny it. The cost of silence had been far too high, and now the weight of that silence would come crashing down on them all. The investigation into the Hensley family had unearthed more than anyone had bargained for. What began as the discovery of a hidden attic filled with broken toys and faded clothes had spiraled into something far more insidious, far more dangerous than anyone could have imagined. Alice had walked into the attic expecting to find the remnants of a family's cruelty, but what she had uncovered was far darker. The truth of the Hensleys was not just a story of one family's twisted desires. It was the story of a deep-rooted hidden network of wealth and power, a group of elites whose beliefs in dark occult practices ran through the veins of the town like a poison. As the investigation progressed, it became clear that Samuel Hensley's actions, his rituals, and his twisted view of power were not born from some personal madness. No, they were part of something much larger, a sinister web of influence that extended far beyond the walls of his mansion. Samuel had been only one cog in a larger machine, one that had woven itself into the fabric of Briarwood and the communities surrounding it. The more the authorities dug, the more they found connections. Old family names, hidden alliances, and business dealings that tied the Hensleys to other prominent families. Families that held power in the town, in the state, and beyond. These were the families that had given Samuel his influence, his position, and his power. They, too, had believed in the occult rituals that Samuel had practiced, the same rituals that had bound their lives to the pursuit of wealth and control. The attic, with its bloodstains and symbols, had been the center of it all. It was no longer just the Hensleys' attic. It was a symbol, a dark reflection of the network that had thrived behind closed doors. The rituals were not just a means of power for Samuel. They were part of a larger, unspoken culture of privilege. A culture that believed its wealth could be preserved not through hard work or ethics, but through blood, sacrifice, and manipulation. The children who had been locked away in that attic had been more than just victims. They had been pawns, offerings in a much larger game, their suffering a small price to pay for the elite's continued control. Alice couldn't escape the growing sense of unease that had taken root in her heart. What had begun as the discovery of one family's horrors had now become something larger, something that reached into the very foundations of the town. The Hensleys, it seemed, had been the tip of the iceberg, a single family whose power and influence had kept their dark actions hidden for decades. But now that the truth was coming to light, the shadow of the Hensley family seemed to stretch farther than ever. Each new revelation tied the family's actions to something more dangerous, more pervasive. The attic, once a symbol of isolation and suffering, had become a graveyard of secrets, a place where the blood of the innocent had been spilled in the name of power. It was the place where the true nature of the Hensley family had been revealed, and where the full extent of their depravity had been laid bare. But it was also a symbol of the larger sickness that had infected the entire town. The rich, the powerful, the elites, they were all complicit, all part of the same system that had allowed the Hensleys' horrors to continue unchecked. As the investigation dug deeper, the authorities were forced to confront an uncomfortable truth. The Hensleys were not alone in their darkness. The attic's secrets had revealed something that no one had been prepared for. an entire network of power, corruption, and control that had thrived in silence, hidden behind the veil of wealth and privilege. The horror was no longer contained within the walls of the Hensley mansion. It had spread, infecting everything it touched. And now, as the town began to uncover the true extent of the Hensley family's actions, they were faced with the terrifying reality that the shadows of the past had not only shaped the town's history, they had shaped its present. The legacy of the Hensleys had been bigger than one family. It was a legacy that stretched into the very heart of Briarwood itself. Years had passed since the fall of the Hensley family, yet the echo of their horrors still lingered in the town of Briarwood. The mansion, once a symbol of wealth and power, now stood in ruins, its walls crumbling under the weight of the truth that had been uncovered. The children, their names whispered but never fully acknowledged, had been erased from the town's collective memory, their suffering buried beneath a veneer of progress and time. In the years following the Hensley scandal, the town's leaders moved quickly to change the laws. Child protection laws were quietly amended, reforms were passed, and the image of a safer, more just community began to take shape. The townspeople celebrated these small victories, applauding themselves for making changes that, in their minds, would ensure that nothing like the Hensley atrocities could ever happen again. Yet as the years passed, the memory of the Hensley children, the ones who had endured unspeakable horrors, faded. A small memorial was erected not far from the ruins of the Hensley mansion, a few weathered stones, a plaque with their names, and a vague inscription that read, "For the forgotten children of Briarwood." It was a token gesture, something to appease the consciences of those who wished to move on, to close the chapter and pretend that the horror had never truly touched them. The town could now point to the memorial and say, "We remember." But no one spoke of the details, of what had truly happened in the attic behind those locked doors. No one mentioned the bloodstains or the rituals that had been performed, the children who had been sacrificed in the name of power and privilege. The true scale of the horrors remained buried, sealed away in the dark corners of the town's history. The children's lives had been erased, their pain swept under the rug. The silence that followed the Hensley family's downfall was not one of healing. It was a silence born of collective denial. People had moved on, their lives untouched by the pain of those who had suffered in the shadows. The laws had changed, yes. The memorial had been built, yes. But the truth had not been fully acknowledged. The town had chosen to forget. The legacy of the Hensley family's cruelty was not something that could be undone with reforms or gestures. It was something that had seeped into the very foundation of Briarwood, an unspoken stain on its history that could never be fully washed away. And though the authorities had investigated, though the families had been exposed, the true nature of the evil that had lived within the walls of the Hensley mansion was never fully understood. It wasn't just Samuel Hensley who was to blame. It wasn't just the family's twisted beliefs. It was the very system that had allowed such a thing to happen. The silence, the indifference, the way the town had looked the other way for so long. The institutional evil that had protected the Hensleys, that had kept their secrets hidden, still operated in the shadows, unnoticed and unchallenged. In the quiet of the memorial and the fading whispers of the townspeople, Alice could still hear the voices of the children. They were the ones who had truly been forgotten, their stories left untold. The legacy of their suffering would never be fully understood, never truly acknowledged. It would live on in the silence of a town that had moved on but never truly healed. And so the Hensleys' dark history would remain a part of Briarwood, a part of the town's blood-soaked past, a haunting reminder of how easily evil could operate in silence, unnoticed by the world. The horrors of the past might fade from memory, but they never truly disappear. And in the end, the silence became their legacy. The Hensley mansion was gone. The once magnificent structure that had stood proudly on the hill, casting its shadow over the town, had been torn down. Brick by brick, timber by timber, the house that had harbored so much darkness was reduced to rubble. The land was cleared, the remains scattered, as if the town hoped that by burying the mansion, it could bury the horrors it had contained. But as the final remnants were hauled away, something lingered. A presence, a whisper that no amount of destruction could silence. The town moved on. The new owners of the property began plans for something more innocuous, a community center or a park, something to erase the final traces of the Hensley legacy from the town's landscape. But the whispers never faded. They echoed in the quiet moments, in the corners of darkened rooms, in the idle conversations of the townspeople. Some spoke of it in hushed tones, their eyes darting nervously as if the very mention of the Hensley family's name might call forth the ghosts of the past. Others had moved on entirely, convinced that the family's fall was an isolated event, a tragedy that had been dealt with. They told themselves that the town was better now, that the children had been forgotten, but the memory of their suffering remained buried beneath layers of false assurances. The memorial stood small and inconspicuous, but it had become little more than a formality, a symbolic gesture to placate the guilt-ridden consciences of those who wished to forget. The truth, the full truth, had never been fully embraced. The authorities, those in power, had buried it, swept it away like dust in the corners of the town's history. They had passed laws, changed systems, but they had never truly confronted the heart of the evil that had festered in the shadows. As long as the elite remained in power, as long as wealth and influence could shield the guilty, the truth would remain hidden. Alice knew it. She could feel it in her bones. The cycle of silence continued. The darkness, the insidious evil that had woven itself into the very fabric of Briarwood, could not be exorcised so easily. It wasn't just the Hensleys who were responsible. It was the system, the complacency, the way society turned a blind eye when the powerful acted with impunity. The Hensleys had been a symptom of something far greater, a cycle that could repeat itself if the lessons of the past were forgotten. And so, as the town carried on, as life returned to its rhythm, the question remained: could this happen again? Could another family, another group of elites hide their darkest secrets behind the walls of wealth and privilege? And could another child, another group of children be sacrificed for the gain of those who believed they were untouchable? The unsettling truth was that the answer was yes. As long as silence was preferred over truth, as long as the powerful were allowed to manipulate and control, evil would always have a home. The legacy of the Hensley family, the suffering they caused, and the lives they destroyed would never be fully erased. It wasn't in the memorial, it wasn't in the words spoken at the town meetings. It was in the quiet, in the way the town continued to move on without truly confronting the past. It was in the way they allowed themselves to forget, to live in the illusion of safety while the cycle of silence persisted. As Alice looked out over the remnants of the Hensley estate, she realized that the mansion was gone, but the evil that had festered within it remained. It lived on in the people who had ignored the cries for help, in the authorities who had failed to act, and in the town that refused to face its own complicity. The Hensleys' legacy wasn't in the crumbled walls or the forgotten children. It was in the silence that still hung over Briarwood, a silence that would only grow louder with time. What lies beneath was not just a question about the land, but about the soul of the town itself. And until that question was answered, until the truth was fully exposed, the cycle would continue. Evil had a way of hiding in plain sight, and Briarwood had learned to look the other way.